I remember the smell before the noise, coal, rain, and something sharp like rust and fear. That smell always came first. Then the station appeared, crowded and quiet at the same time, a place where nobody dared to breathe too loudly. I was 8 years old when they told us we were leaving Paris. My mother packed our life into one brown suitcase and a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. She said we were going somewhere safe, but her hands trembled each time she tied the string. I noticed the tremor, though I pretended not to. At 8, you learn to read silence faster than words. We left at dawn. The air was cold and the streets were empty except for the boots, always the boots. I counted them as we walked, 4 soldiers in front, 2 behind. Their rifles gleamed wet under the morning drizzle. My father had already been taken months before, so it was just my mother, my little brother David, and me. At the station, I remember a woman trying to give her baby to someone on the other side of the barrier. A guard shoved her back so hard she fell. The baby kept crying as the train's whistle began to rise. That sound cut through the air like a blade. Inside the cattle car it was dark. Someone had carved words into the wood. Nous reviendrons. We will return. I didn't understand then, but I traced the letters with my finger. The grooves were deep, as if someone had carved them with desperation, not a knife. The door slammed shut, and the world disappeared. It was a darkness filled with breath, dozens of us, pressed together, swaying with the rhythm of the train. Every few seconds the wheels clacked like a heartbeat. I remember counting the sounds to stay awake. Clack, 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 clack. If I stopped counting, I thought the train would forget me. My mother kept me close, her arm around my shoulders, whispering prayers in Hebrew I didn't know. I could feel the bones of her wrist, the way they pressed against my skin, as she whispered, Adonai Shmor Otanu. God protect us. Somewhere in the dark a man began to sing, softly, barely audible. It wasn't a song I knew, but the melody carried something fragile and human through the cold. A few people joined in, humming. My brother fell asleep against my lap, his face pale and damp with sweat. Hours passed, maybe days. When the door opened again, light stabbed into the car. The air outside smelled like smoke. A man shouted orders. We were in a place called Drancy, though I didn't know the name then. They separated us by age, children on one side, adults on the other. My mother knelt in front of me, her hands cupping my face. Stay with David, she said. Don't let go of his hand. Whatever happens, don't let go. Her voice cracked when she said it. I remember thinking that she was trying to memorize my face. I nodded, but the soldiers were already pulling her away. She turned once, just once, her scarf slipping from her hair as she disappeared into the crowd. That was the last time I saw her. The days in Drancy were gray and endless. We slept on straw and ate watery soup. But the strange thing was the quiet. No birds, no laughter, just the murmur of trains passing. You could tell the difference between an incoming convoy and an outgoing one by the sound of the brakes. The ones leaving always screeched longer, as if the tracks themselves were reluctant to let them go. Sometimes new children arrived. They came with notes pinned to their clothes, names scribbled by desperate parents, others left never to return. I learned to stop asking questions. There was a man, a guard, who used to whistle when he walked past the children's barracks. He had a crooked nose and always whistled the same tune, La Vie en Rose. One day he didn't. That's how I knew something was wrong. That same afternoon, they told us to get ready to board another train. David was sick. His fever had risen through the night. He could barely stand. I begged the guard to let him stay, but he pushed us both toward the line. No exceptions, he said in rough French. That was when the decision was made. Not by me, but by someone watching. A woman in a gray coat stepped forward. I had never seen her before. She whispered something to the officer, handed him a piece of paper, and pointed at us. Then she turned to me and said quietly, Take your brother and follow me." We followed her through a narrow corridor, down a flight of concrete stairs that smelled of damp earth. There, behind a metal door, she handed me a small loaf of bread and a piece of chalk. "Write nothing," she said, "and speak to no one. When you hear the next train whistle, run to the end of the tunnel. Someone will be waiting." I didn't understand who she was. Maybe a nurse, maybe someone from the resistance. But that night, when the train screamed and the ground shook, I did as she said. David was too weak to run, so I carried him. The tunnel was dark, but at the far end I saw a lantern. A man lifted us into a cart covered with hay. He didn't speak. We drove through the night. By the time the sky began to turn gray again, I realized we were no longer on the train. We were free, or something close to it. But freedom, I would learn, is not a single moment. It's a series of narrow escapes stitched together by luck and loss. That was only the beginning. The man who rescued us from the tunnel never told me his name. He smelled of tobacco and rain, and his hands were rough like the bark of old trees. We rode for hours in silence, the cart bouncing over stones and roots. Every time I opened my mouth to ask where we were going, he lifted a finger to his lips. When the sun began to rise, we reached a small farmhouse hidden behind a line of tall poplars. Chickens wandered near the fence, and smoke drifted from a crooked chimney. To me, after the camp and the train, it looked like a dream drawn in color. Inside, a woman was kneading dough on a wooden table. She looked up and froze when she saw us. The man whispered something to her, something too quick for me to catch, and she nodded. Then she took my brother from my arms and touched his forehead. "He has fever," she murmured. "He needs rest." They gave us warm milk and bread. I remember the taste, soft, salty, and alive. I hadn't tasted real food in weeks. My brother barely sipped before falling asleep on the straw mattress by the stove. For the first time in what felt like forever, I heard birds outside. The woman's name was Colette. She told me we were somewhere near Limoges, in the countryside, far from Paris and the trains. "You'll stay here for a few days," she said, "until it's safe to move again." But a few days became weeks, then months. We stayed hidden in the attic, a narrow space beneath the roof beams. The air smelled of dust and apples. Through a crack in the tiles, I could see a strip of sky. Sometimes I'd lie awake at night watching it darken and pale again, wondering if my mother could see the same moon from wherever she was. Colette would bring us food when the neighbors weren't around: soup, cheese, sometimes potatoes. She taught me how to keep quiet when soldiers came. Once, they searched the barn, shouting and laughing. I remember Colette pressing her hand over my mouth as the boots thudded below us. Her pulse beat fast against my skin. When they left, she whispered, "Never breathe too loudly when fear's in the room." David's health returned slowly. He grew thinner, but started to laugh again, small bursts of joy that startled me. He played with the dust motes in the air, chasing them with his fingers as if they were fireflies. Sometimes when Colette felt safe, she let us come downstairs after dark. We'd sit near the fire, and she'd tell stories, fairy tales twisted by war. Once there was a fox who pretended to be a wolf to save his cubs, she said one night. He fooled everyone, even the hunters. I didn't realize then that she was telling her own story, because Colette wasn't just a farmer's wife. She was part of the resistance. I learned this the night a man came with papers hidden in a loaf of bread. They spoke in low voices, spreading maps on the table. I was supposed to be asleep in the corner, but I listened. I heard the words rail lines, Gestapo, and evacuation. That same night, Colette burned the papers in the fireplace and told me, "Never repeat what you hear. Words can betray faster than people." Her husband, the man who had rescued us, didn't return after that. Colette never cried. She just looked out the window for a long time and said, "He was brave, but bravery doesn't always come home." The war pressed on, though we didn't see it directly. We heard it in distant explosions, the hum of planes, the sudden silence when the radio stopped working. The seasons changed. Winter froze the fields, spring brought mud and thunder. I grew older in that attic. My hair darkened, my face thinned. I learned how to stay still for hours, how to tell time by light, how to live between footsteps. Then one morning Colette came up with tears in her eyes, and a small smile that didn't reach them. "It's over," she whispered. "The Germans are gone." I didn't understand. Gone where? How could something that had filled every second of my life simply vanish? We stepped outside. The sky was a blue I'd never seen before, too wide, too open. People were shouting, laughing, waving flags. Someone gave me a piece of chocolate, and I didn't know whether to eat it or hide it. For a moment, I thought everything would return to the way it was, that we would go back to Paris, find our home, find our mother. But the world after war is not the world before it. Our house was gone. Our names were gone. Even the people who knew us looked through us like smoke. A woman from the Red Cross came to the village, asking for children who had been hidden. Colette gave her our names, Sarah and David Klein, and hugged us goodbye. "You must tell them I was only a farmer's wife," she said. "No more than that." I tried to thank her, but she shook her head. "Just remember to live," she said. "That's thanks enough." They took us to a shelter in Lyon filled with children like us, thin, quiet, waiting for someone who would never come. Every night, the nurses called names from a list. Sometimes a child would run forward shouting, "Mama," or "Papa." But most nights, no one came. I used to dream that my mother was still on a train, still moving, still coming back. In my dreams, I'd hear the whistle, that long, haunting cry, and run to the window. But the tracks near Lyon were overgrown with weeds. The trains were gone. One afternoon, a man arrived at the shelter with a photograph. He said he was from the Jewish Relief Organization in Switzerland. The photo showed a woman with the same eyes as my mother, standing beside a fence. But the man looked at me sadly. "This was taken at Bergen-Belsen," he said. "I'm sorry." I didn't cry, not then. I just folded the picture and kept it in my pocket. That night I lay awake and thought about Colette, about the tunnel, about the trains. I realized the world would always be made of rails, some leading forward, some ending in smoke. But I had stepped off them once, and somehow that had made me free. They called it liberation, but it didn't feel like freedom. Freedom should be loud, full of light and laughter. For us, it came quietly, with paperwork lists and long lines in buildings that smelled of disinfectant and fatigue. After the war, I was sent to a children's home near Marseille. They told us we were displaced persons. Though the truth was simpler, we were children without homes, without families, without places to return to. The house had peeling paint and high windows that trapped the heat. There were dozens of us, Polish, Hungarian, French, all speaking in fragments of languages that didn't fit together. We didn't play. We waited for food, for letters, for someone to say our names and mean them. My brother David was growing faster than I could recognize. He was 9 then, thin as paper but restless, always wanting to climb fences and chase the stray dogs that wandered the yard. Sometimes, when I tried to stop him, he'd say, "We're not hiding anymore, Sarah. We're free." But I couldn't believe that yet. Freedom had taken too much from me to trust it. One morning a man from the Youth Aliyah organization arrived. He spoke softly, with an accent I didn't know. He said they were helping Jewish children start new lives in Palestine, a place where no one would ever hunt us again. He showed us a photograph, children our age planting trees under a blazing sun. They were smiling, wearing short sleeves, their arms strong and brown. It didn't look real to me. I'd spent years in the cold, hiding under roofs, breathing in dust. The idea of warmth felt like something from another lifetime. But the man kept saying, "You'll have a home there, you'll belong." I didn't know what belonging meant anymore. Still, when they called for volunteers, David raised his hand. and I, as always, followed. The journey south was long. We rode in the back of a truck filled with children clutching satchels and photographs. Some sang softly, others stared at their shoes. The air smelled of diesel and fear. Every bump on the road reminded me of the trains, and I had to fight the urge to hide under the bench. At the port of Marseille, we saw the sea for the first time. It stretched farther than anything I'd ever imagined. Wide, endless, alive. The organizers told us to board a small ship, bound for Haifa. The hull was rusted, the deck crowded, but no one complained. We were too tired to speak, too afraid to hope. On the second night I stood by the railing, the wind tangling my hair. The stars reflected on the waves like scattered glass. A sailor passed by and said, "First time at sea?" I nodded. He smiled. "The sea remembers nothing," he said. "That's why people trust it." I thought about that for a long time. I wondered if forgetting was another kind of survival. When we arrived in Palestine, the heat stunned me. The air was thick with dust and orange blossoms. People shouted in languages I didn't understand, Hebrew, Arabic, English. A storm of voices that made me dizzy. They took us to a kibbutz near Tel Aviv. Rows of white tents lined the fields. For the first time since the attic, we slept under open sky. I was 17 then, though I felt much older. They gave us new clothes, new names if we wanted them, and work to fill the days. Planting trees, milking cows, digging irrigation ditches. The rhythm of labor steadied me. The land didn't ask questions. It didn't know what I'd seen. Sometimes at dusk, the sky turned gold and everything looked clean, untouched. That's when I'd feel closest to peace, not because I'd forgotten, but because the land didn't remind me. David thrived there. He learned Hebrew quickly, ran barefoot through the orchards, laughed with the other boys. Watching him, I began to understand what it meant to start over, not as a denial of the past, but as a defiance of it. Still, nights were difficult. The sound of the trains came back in dreams, the metallic clatter, the echo of doors slamming. I'd wake up gasping, the scent of smoke in my nose, though there was none. One of the counselors, a woman named Henrietta, told me, "You survived the war, Sarah. Now you must survive the silence." The silence, I learned, was heavier than fear. In the war, I'd lived moment to moment. Afterward, time stretched endlessly, filled with ghosts. The living didn't talk about the dead, not because they didn't care, but because words had become fragile things, too small for what we'd lost. Years passed. I worked in the fields, taught children to read, built walls that would one day hold real homes. Sometimes reporters visited, asking for stories. "Tell us how you escaped," they'd say. But how could I explain that escape wasn't a single act, but a lifetime of choices between breathing and breaking? Once, a photographer asked to take my picture beside the olive trees. "You're the girl who survived the trains," he said. I nodded, though the title felt like a stranger's name. After he left, I sat on the ground and watched the sunset burn through the dust. I realized survival wasn't about running from the past. It was about carrying it carefully, like a fragile seed, until it found a place to grow. David became a teacher. He married, had children of his own. When his daughter was born, he named her Colette. When I held her for the first time, I thought of the woman who had hidden us, the smell of bread and smoke in that farmhouse, the whisper, "Just remember to live." I finally understood what she meant, because survival is not just being alive. It's learning how to live again, knowing that the tracks are still there, but you're walking beside them now, free, but never forgetting. For a long time, I avoided Europe, even after Israel became home, after the fields turned green and the sound of Hebrew felt familiar on my tongue. I could not bring myself to return. Every letter from abroad, from aid workers, from old acquaintances who somehow found me, carried the scent of soot and iron. I kept them folded inside a box beneath my bed. I told myself the past belonged there too, sealed away. But history, is never content to stay buried. It always finds its way back, like a train that circles the same tracks endlessly. In 1961, I was asked to testify in Jerusalem at the trial of a man named Adolf Eichmann. I didn't know his face, but I knew his work. We all did. He had organized the trains, the ones that took my parents, my neighbors, the boys who once played soccer on my street, the ones that nearly took me. When the summons came, my first instinct was to refuse. I didn't want to be a witness. I wanted to be a woman who planted trees, who lived quietly, who laughed sometimes without guilt. But something in me stirred, maybe duty, maybe anger, maybe both. In the courtroom, the air was heavy with silence. The man in the glass booth looked ordinary. That was what unsettled me most. Not the face of a monster, but the face of a bureaucrat. Pale, forgettable, unremarkable. The kind of man who might have walked past me in the street without noticing the child hiding in the shadows. When it was my turn to speak, I felt my throat tighten. The judge waited, the journalist stared, and suddenly the words came. I told them about the attic, the darkness, the smell of burning, the day my mother pushed me toward the open door and whispered, "Run." I didn't cry, not because I was brave, but because I had spent a lifetime learning how not to. When I stepped down from the stand, a young woman approached me. She wasn't much older than I had been when the war ended. She said, "My mother was on one of those trains too. Thank you for speaking." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. For the first time in years I felt seen, not as a survivor, not as a symbol, but as someone who had carried a truth too long in silence. After the trial, people began asking questions again. Historians, filmmakers, students, they wanted details, dates, numbers, names. But memory doesn't work that way. It's not an archive, it's a heartbeat. Sometimes I'd walk through the kibbutz at dawn and think of all the things I didn't remember. The faces that had blurred, the voices that had faded. Guilt, I learned, isn't about what you did. It's about what you couldn't save. One spring, David and I returned to France. He wanted to show his children where we had been born. I didn't want to go, but I went anyway. For him, and for the ghosts that still waited along the old tracks. Paris looked different, louder, more impatient. The war felt like a rumor there, something folded neatly into museums and history books. In the countryside, we found the remains of the farmhouse where we had hidden. Only the stone foundation remained. The rest had been swallowed by grass and time. I knelt by the ruins and ran my hand along the earth. Beneath my palm, I felt the cold shape of metal. An old hinge, maybe from the trapdoor. It was rusted and broken but real. I held it in my hand like proof. That night we stayed in a small inn nearby. The owner was kind, curious. He asked if we were tourists. I said yes. It was easier than explaining we were ghosts visiting the living. On the train back to Paris, the sound of the wheels struck me like a memory. That relentless rhythm, clack, 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 echoing across years. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. This time I didn't flinch. The noise didn't mean death anymore. It meant movement, return, continuity. When we arrived home, I placed the rusted hinge on my windowsill. The metal caught the sunlight every morning, and somehow it reminded me that even broken things can still reflect the light. Years passed. I became a teacher, then a librarian. I surrounded myself with books, stories that dared to remember when so many preferred to forget. I taught children who had never known war about words like courage, witness, and hope. Sometimes when they asked where I had learned those lessons, I simply said, "From the trains." But privately I feared something else, that when my generation was gone, the silence would return. The world moves quickly, and memory fades faster than we like to admit. Photographs turn yellow, names disappear into archives, and soon, what was once unbearable becomes distant, a story told to fill an hour, then forgotten again. That fear stayed with me. So I began writing, not for historians or newspapers, but for the children who would come after. I wrote about my mother's voice, about the attic, about the smell of spring rain on a tin roof. I wrote about the man who risked his life for strangers, and the woman who baked bread when there was none left to bake. I didn't write about the horror, not directly. The world has enough of that. I wrote about what it means to survive the horror, to keep choosing life even when the world has shown you its worst face. When David died, his daughter, my niece, Colette, found my notebooks. She read them in silence, then said, "Aunt Sarah, you've turned memory into a kind of light." I smiled. "No," I told her. "Memory is the light. I just carried it. I'm old now. The doctors say my heart is tired, and perhaps they're right. It beats like an echo, softer each year. But still it beats. Sometimes I wonder if it keeps going out of stubbornness, as if my body itself refuses to let the past end with me. I live in a small apartment overlooking the sea. The air smells of salt and jasmine. Every morning, I sit by the window with my tea and watch the trains passing in the distance, thin silver lines cutting across the horizon. People still travel by train, though few ever think about what those tracks once carried. The sound no longer frightens me. It comforts me, proof that movement continues, that life insists on returning to the same paths, but with gentler cargo. I keep a box on the table beside my bed. Inside are photographs, letters, and a small piece of rusted metal, the hinge from the farmhouse. When I hold it, I feel the years collapse into a single breath. I am the girl again, hiding under the floorboards, counting heartbeats. I am the young woman on the boat to Haifa, clutching her brother's hand. I am the witness in the courtroom, the teacher in the classroom, the woman who never stopped writing. All of them are me. All of them are still here. Sometimes young people visit me, students mostly. They come with notebooks and questions. What was it like? How did you survive? Do you still believe in people? I tell them the truth, or at least my truth, that surviving was not a single act. It was 1,000 small choices. To eat, to walk, to speak, to remember. And yes, I still believe in people. Not because they are good, but because they can be. Because I have seen both the cruelty that destroys and the kindness that saves. And I learned that the latter, though rarer, shines brighter and lasts longer. One boy once asked, "Do you forgive them?" I looked at him for a long time before answering. "I don't think forgiveness is mine to give," I said, "but I refuse to let them own my hatred. That is how I won." At night, when the world quiets, I sometimes dream of my mother. She's standing at the doorway again, her hand on my cheek, her eyes calm. But in the dream, there are no soldiers, no shouting, no trains. Just the two of us surrounded by light. She doesn't speak, but I understand what she means. You made it. Keep living. When I wake, I feel her presence like sunlight through glass. The historians say there will soon be no more of us left, no more witnesses. The last generation of those who remember will fade, and memory will become history, and history will become lesson. But lessons can be forgotten too. That is what frightens me most. So I write letters, hundreds of them, to strangers, to schools, to anyone willing to listen. I sign each one the same way. Remember us not for how we died, but for how we tried to live. One afternoon, I received a package. Inside was a drawing, a child's sketch of a girl standing beside a train, the sun rising behind her. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, it said, "For Sarah, who kept the light on." I cried then, not out of sadness, but because I knew, somehow across decades and oceans, the story had found its way forward. When the evening falls, I sometimes imagine the faces of those I lost, my parents, my neighbors, David's mother, the woman with the red scarf from the station. They are all standing in the light now, watching, and I think, Maybe that is what survival truly means. Not to live forever, but to keep someone else's memory alive inside you long enough for it to be passed on. I don't fear death anymore. The world is full of noise again. Laughter, songs, arguments, trains. Life has returned, and I have had the privilege to witness it. Before I close my eyes at night, I whisper a small prayer. That the children who inherit this world will learn not just from our suffering, but from our endurance. That they will understand that silence is dangerous, but remembrance is power. Outside, another train passes. The sound fades slowly into the wind. I smile, because somewhere on some platform another girl is waiting, not in fear, but in hope. And this time the train will take her somewhere worth arriving.